Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to unpack the story of the Unification Church. It's a wild ride, how one of the most controversial religious movements of the 20th century went from a single prophet's vision in Korea to a full-blown global political and economic empire right here in America. So, how did a group often labeled a cult become such a global powerhouse? I mean, you've almost certainly heard the term Moonies, right? Or you've seen those incredible images of their mass weddings. But behind all that, there's this really remarkable story. It's a mix of incredible faith, intense public backlash, some seriously shrewd political moves, and, believe it or not, the birth of a massive corporate empire. And yeah, to really get a grip on this empire, you have to start with the man right at the center of it all, the self-proclaimed Messiah himself, Reverend Sun Myung Moon. All right, first up, the prophet's vision. Let's dig into the core beliefs that actually launched this whole movement and, sent it sprawling across the globe. Okay, so this is the absolute bedrock of the church. It's a text called the Divine Principle. And what it does is, well, it basically reinterprets the entire Bible. It argues that Jesus, he succeeded spiritually, sure, but he failed to get married and create a perfect physical family. So according to this text, that massive unfinished job, that physical mission, fell to a new Messiah, a third Adam from Korea. And that person, they believe, was Sun Myung Moon. So just think about that timeline for a second. It all starts in 1935 with a personal vision. By 54, he's founded a formal organization in Seoul. And then boom, just 5 years later in 59, the first missionary is already on American soil. In less than 25 years, a private revelation in Korea becomes a global mission. Next up, the American Crusade. So for years, the movement was pretty much on the fringe here. But everything changes in 1971, when Moon himself lands in the US. And he comes with this incredibly powerful message, one that was perfectly tailored for the Cold War. You have to remember, he was forged in post-war Korea, and his hardcore anti-communism, well, that was going to be his golden ticket for gaining influence in America. And this is where you see this massive disconnect. On the inside, the members saw themselves as like a spiritual army with this huge divine mission for world peace. But on the outside, the public saw something totally different. They saw Moonies, these kids who seemed brainwashed, living in communes and selling flowers on the street. And that image, it just fueled a ton of fear and suspicion. And then, they did this. This was the move that changed absolutely everything. They took out full-page newspaper ads defending Richard Nixon right in the middle of the Watergate scandal. Can you imagine? By throwing their public and financial weight behind Nixon, Moon just catapulted his pretty obscure group right into the national spotlight. I mean, people thought it was bizarre, they ridiculed it, but it did two things. It cemented their anti-communist identity, and it made them absolutely impossible to ignore. But, that kind of high visibility, it definitely comes at a price. And for them, that price was intense scrutiny from the government. Suddenly, everybody in Washington was asking the same questions. Where is all this cash coming from? And what are the real political intentions of this church? The US government decided it was time to get some answers. Part 3, fighting for legitimacy. Okay, so now they're in the hot seat. They're facing a really hostile public and a bunch of federal investigations. The church was basically forced into a whole new phase, a fight for its very survival in America. And then came this devastating blow. There was this big congressional investigation into a scandal called Koreagate, which was all about South Korean influence in Washington. The final report from that committee, the Fraser Committee, was just brutal. It basically concluded that the Unification Church wasn't really a religion at all, but a political and economic machine, one that was being directed by the South Korean CIA to push Korean influence in the US. A total bombshell. But believe it or not, Moon's biggest battle wasn't even with Congress. It was with the IRS. With the church's reputation already in tatters, the government made its next move. And this time, they didn't go after the institution. They went after the man himself. And that led to a massive blockbuster criminal trial. Yep, 13 months. He was ultimately convicted of tax evasion and conspiracy, and he served 13 months in a federal prison. Now, for his followers, this was not a criminal conviction. To them, it was a crucifixion. They framed the whole thing as an act of religious persecution. And here's the ironic part. That actually won him sympathy from some mainstream conservative religious leaders who were also worried about government overreach. So let's talk about building a global empire. Because after surviving all of that, the public hostility, the legal battles, the church makes this really crucial pivot. It's a total strategic shift. They decided to move away from trying to convert people on the street and instead focus on building quiet, institutional power. And this right here, this was their new playbook. And it was pretty brilliant. The logic was basically, if we can't win hearts and minds on the street, let's build influence from the top down. So what did they do? 1, they founded the Washington Times to have a conservative voice right in the nation's capital. 2, they funded academic groups to get scholars on their side. And 3, they created political organizations to build alliances with powerful right-wing leaders, all united by anti-communism. And they backed up this entire strategy with a massive and, honestly, super diverse economic engine. I mean, we're talking about everything from the Washington Times to the True World Group, a huge international seafood company that supplies sushi to restaurants all over America, to owning the landmark New York Hotel. At this point, they were operating way more like a global corporation than a church. So yeah, the cult was now a full-on conglomerate. By the time we hit the 21st century, the transformation was basically complete. The main focus was no longer recruiting members on the street. It was about managing assets and pulling levers of influence behind the scenes. Okay, Section 5, the Kingdom Divided. Here's the thing. This entire massive empire was built around the singular charismatic authority of just one man. So what happens when he's gone? Well, when Sun Myung Moon died in 2012, the foundations of that kingdom, they began to crack. Turns out, a church built around a living Messiah isn't really prepared for his death. The power vacuum he left behind was immense, and it immediately pitted members of his own family against each other. The movement split right down the middle into rival factions. So here's how the split looks. On one side, you've got the mainstream church. It's now called the Family Federation, and it's led by Moon's widow, Hak Jahan Moon, known as the True Mother. She controls almost all the money and the big institutions. And on the other side, you have a radical splinter group, the Sanctuary Church, led by his son, Sean Moon, who now calls himself the Second King. And if you want to understand just how deep this split is, look no further than this. The original church was famous for its mass weddings, the blessings of couples. The Son's new Sanctuary Church? Well, it became infamous for ceremonies blessing AR-15 rifles, which they literally call the biblical rods of iron. From blessing couples to blessing rifles, it's a shocking shift. So where does that leave the mainstream church today? Well, their biggest challenge isn't converting new members anymore. It's trying to manage this huge corporate empire while their actual religious community is shrinking, and their reputation keeps getting hammered by the actions of its own radical offshoot. So the prophet is gone, the empire is fractured. What's the future for the house that Moon built? I think the big takeaway here is how a global movement built entirely on one man's messianic claims is now fighting for its very soul. What's left is this incredibly complex legacy in America, a major conservative media outlet, huge financial power, and a family and a faith that is just deeply, deeply divided.